Anyway, we're very honoured to have David Kogan with us. I don't know if anybody's looked him up on Wikipedia or anything else, but he has a considerable CV. I shall not go through it all. I think if anything is of relevance, he will tell us. Other than the fact that he's worked extensively, both as a journalist and an executive in various media outlets, including the BBC, where he was very involved with the Today programme, which has gone downhill ever since. And he's also worked in the United States. He was, until last Friday, the CEO of the Magnum Photography Co-op, which you probably all know about. I hope that's not of relevance to the Labour Party, but it just might be. What he did in 1981 was publish a book which was The Battle for the Labour Party. The new book, which we're not really allowed to talk about for another month, is the sequel to that. And he's going to tell us a bit about it. He's happy to have questions put to him, because that way he knows what you want to know rather than giving you what he wants to tell you. And the book, which will be published next month, there are some leaflets. There are also booking. You can reserve a copy at a big discount. I was just going to say that. So, for all those reasons, we're very lucky he's here today. We're very lucky he's actually come to Leeds, and we have the opportunity to hear his views on what is probably one of the most topical matters that he could possibly talk about, and that is it the demise of the Labour Party? It's something about the Labour Party anyway, so pin your ears back.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I understand that you much prefer debating about the merger of two synagogues in the city, so I'm sorry to disappoint you about something that's much less disputatious, which is the future of the Labour Party. Just to add slightly more flesh to the story of how this book was to be written and why I wrote it. In 1977, I was at a party as chairman of the then Oxford Labour Club. I met the then chairman of the Cambridge Labour Club, and we got drunk together and got into a foul argument about politics. And the guy I got in an argument with is a guy called John Lansman, who some of you may have mentioned. And John Lansman, I just say it now, is one of my oldest and closest friends since those rows. We've been rowing ever since. And I watched him as we both left our respective universities in 1979, both of us a month after Margaret Thatcher had been elected Prime Minister. I watched him as he got more and more immersed in what became the first generation of the left to succeed in the Labour Party in that period, which I'll talk about a bit more in a moment, between 1979 and 1983, as he became an acolyte of Tony Benn's. And I decided, I by then was a reporter, radio reporter, and then joined the BBC. But in the interim, I thought it would be a good idea to write a book, I was 23, about the left-wing groups around Tony Benn, the people nobody was writing about, people nobody had heard of. A man called Vladimir Dira, who I'll come back to in a moment. And that book, also because I covered Ken Livingstone at County Hall and a man called John McDonnell, who was his finance director, who nobody had ever heard of. That book was written and was published in 1981, then again in 1982, serialized in the Times, and suddenly I'd become a political journalist with a handle on a story that nobody else had got. None of the national media were interested in covering it. And then the left stopped. And for 35 years, they were in the wilderness. In 2015, I had a habit with John Lansman of watching general election programs. And that night in 2015, another close friend of mine is a man called David Treisman. I suddenly realized it's three Jews in a room arguing about... Anyway, there we go. Three Jews in a room arguing. David Treisman, former Blairite, General Secretary of the Labour Party, very good friend. He and John and I watched Ed Miliband lose that election. And a great row started. And the following morning, John Lansman sat at my breakfast table calling people about who they might run to be leader of the Labour Party, never imagining for one moment they would win. And the name Jeremy Corbyn was not on that shortlist, which was written at my kitchen table. And I watched then the extraordinary events of the following 6 to 9 months, which we'll talk about in a second, and then thought, actually, the first view of this book, the first theme of this book is, the rise, fall, and rise again of the left has not been covered by anybody who was there first time round. Lots of biographies about Jeremy Corbyn as if he just descended from Planet Zargborg as a leader of the left, including one by Tom Bauer quite recently, which seems to dwell much more on his sex life, Jeremy Corbyn's sex life, which is a subject I've managed to avoid as much as possible. But nobody had really looked at what had gone on in the Labour Party. So the first theme of the book was, could I resurrect my relationship with the left and start interviewing them, but also go and interview people in New Labour. So this book the new book has got 50 interviews in it. Everybody from people you know, Tony Blair, a lot of Brownites, Ed Miliband, I got the first major interview with Ed Miliband, but also a lot of people, just like the first book, from both the left and from New Labour, who have never spoken on the record before about what has happened. So the first theme of the book is the 45-year history of the Labour Party, trying to answer one very simple question, which is, since 1945, there have been 3 leaders of the Labour Party who have won power from the Conservatives in a general election. Attlee, Wilson, Blair. 3. Since 1945. Since 1979, there have been 10 general elections, of which Labour have only won 3, all under Blair. So essentially, and I know where I stand as I say this, the Labour Party is a bit like Leeds United. I mean, it was once a great football club that was kind of capable of getting to finals but not really winning very much. And then basically for the last 40 years has won almost nothing. I'm a Spurs fan. The same could be said about Spurs as well. The issue of how Labour has failed, how Labour as a party of protest or a party of power is the second theme of the book. If the first is the left, and how it rose, fell, and rose again. The second is how Labour itself has not, as a successful electoral force, really punched its weight, except for extraordinary moments in its history. And the third theme, which wasn't the theme that when the book Treatment was originally written in April, so it's only been 11 months, actually fewer than those, 10 months since I started the idea of this book, was 2015 onwards. My view was this book would be a book about the left in the wilderness, culminating in 2015. The book now, unfortunately for my publisher and for me, finishes last week with the 7 Labour MPs leaving. And within that original treatment, anti-Semitism was part of a chapter about Corbyn and his political past. It was not about events of today, which was a wrong call. And now there are 2 extensive chapters about what has happened in the Labour Party and anti-Semitism. And Brexit was almost the end of the book without knowing whether it was going to be resolved. Well, Brexit clearly now has become a much bigger book, a much bigger part of the book. So what I propose to do, keeping my eye on the time, if it's all right with all of you, is I'll talk for about a quarter of an hour about events up to 2010, because it's all about context, and what happened to the left in the early part of that period, how New Labour failed. Then I will talk a bit about events post-2015, Corbyn's election, the chicken coup, as it was known in 2016. If you don't know what I'm referring to, you will. I'm not proposing to talk about anti-Semitism or Brexit because I assume some of you have some questions about that, and it's better that you lead me into my answers than I just give you a speech about it. And I'm hoping that will give us plenty of time for questions, 20, 25 minutes, if Elizabeth allows it. So is that okay with everybody? Bit of history, what actually happened in 2015 onwards, and where we are now and where we're going. So the important story starts for the left when Harold Wilson in 1973 decided to ignore the National Executive Committee of the Labour Party, who wanted to put a proposal nationalising the top 25 British companies, a proposal written by Tony Benn, and Wilson, like most Labour leaders, including Jeremy Corbyn, ignored his National Executive and ignored the manifesto and decided to ignore it. And this inflamed the resistance of a man in 11 Park Drive, Golders Green, a man called Vladimir Dira, who with his wife Vera Dira created an organisation called the Campaign for Labour Party Democracy. And my first book was all about Vladimir and what he did. He attracted a few acolytes, one of whom was John Lansman, who was then an unemployed van driver. That's what a Cambridge degree gets you. Should have gone to Oxford. And they formulated the strategy the only way, as the Labour government in the 70s was beginning to collapse under economic crisis, the only way the left could win then was boringly. The more boring, the better. And the way that you boringly won power then, and indeed the way the left boringly won power in 2015, was by constitutional change through constituency parties. And the original idea of CLPD was that it would focus on the conference writing a manifesto, so the leader couldn't write it, motivated by Wilson's decision in 73. And that slowly got expanded through 1978 and 1979 into mandatory reselection, which got passed in 1979, and then on the election of the leader. But election of the leader was always an afterthought until really they realized that they could get through an electoral college where for the first time after 1980, the Parliamentary Labour Party would lose the unique power to elect the leader. The last leader of the Labour Party to be elected purely by MPs was Michael Foot in 1980. And his deputy, who was elected unopposed, was one Dennis Healey, who the left then challenged, as you will remember, those of you who do remember this, by Tony Benn in 1981. Now, throughout that period of 2 or 3 years, CLPD and the left basically concentrated on the strategy of influencing trade union delegations and constituency parties to put motions up to conference, which would then be backed by people they could maneuver and persuade to support them. And nobody in the leadership, nobody in the right, and certainly nobody from one of the other tribes of the Labour Party spotted what was going on until it was too late. And that was the first great set of victories for the left, where in 1981 and 1982, with Tony Benn losing to Dennis Healey by less than 1% of the Electoral College, it looked as though the left were going to be able to take on Margaret Thatcher, that Benn himself would run for the leadership after Michael Foot retired, and that the left would run the Labour Party in the 1980s. And the parallels between what happened between 1979 and 1982 with what's happened in the last 3 or 4 years are becoming stronger by the day. Because the way the left have always managed to work, and it's an entirely legitimate tactic, was by using the organs of the party to take power and to influence others. They never really thought they'd ever win the leadership, but you could influence the leadership by going through constituency parties and through trade union delegations. The thing that blocked that, and where it all fell apart, and this again is becoming more and more resonant with events now, were 3 other events taking place. The first was that a group of Labour MPs, led by Roy Jenkins and Shirley Williams and David Owen and William Rogers, as most of you will remember, decided they could no longer stomach the fight. And in 1981, the day after Labour had its special conference creating the Electoral College, in 1981, on January the 26th, they created what became the SDP. And Labour MPs, 1 Conservative MP, and 20-odd Labour MPs left to create the SDP. And at that moment, if you look at polling data from 1981 and 1982, before the Falklands War, Labour saw a cataclysmic drop in its polling. Margaret Thatcher, who was not the Margaret Thatcher we remember, Margaret Thatcher was running a divided cabinet, was putting forward monetary economic policies that most of her cabinet did not disagree with. Margaret Thatcher was running neck and neck with Labour, a poor second and third to the SDP, which was running at 40% in the polls. And then you had the Falklands War, where Margaret Thatcher transformed herself into Britannia, winning the Falklands War and suddenly winning the 1983 election. So the first direct effect of the left was it pushed people out of the party. Nothing changes. The second unexpected consequence was, and this is where life is different today, is that trade union barons in 1981 and 1982, running the major unions, saw this challenge coming from the grassroots, coming from the constituencies, as being far too big a threat. And a group of trade union leaders essentially started corralling votes and support against the left in all the elections in the Labour Party, and were then desperate to find candidates who could beat them for the leadership. And this was the third effect. The 1983 general election. The 1983 general election had 4 remarkable results. 3 positive, 1 negative, I suppose. The first positive was that 3 future leaders of the Labour Party were all elected on the same day. So Tony Blair, who'd been a young lawyer who'd been advising Michael Foot on the expulsion of militant, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, and Jeremy Corbyn were all elected as MPs in 1983. Rather remarkable generation. The other effect was that Tony Benn lost his seat in Bristol, and the left was suddenly without a leader. So you suddenly had a power vacuum in 1983 in which the soft left and the soft right came together to elect Neil Kinnock and Roy Hattersley as leader and deputy leader. Now, as we look at parallels with today, and this is a question I'm going to be asked a lot, I suspect, when I do media stuff over the next 3 or 4 months, if you're looking at the future of the Labour Party today in a post-Corbyn era, and we'll come on and talk about that, the question you have to ask yourself is, who is the Neil Kinnock of 2020? Who indeed is Roy Hattersley of 2020? Who are the candidates that can come forward within the context of the Labour Party today who are not of the left, who can reunite the political party in the way they did in 1983? If you buy this second book of mine, there is a lot of data, a lot of interviews, both from Neil Kinnock himself and from John Landsman and from John McDonnell and from a lot of people in that period, Peter Mandelson, of how Neil Kinnock spent 9 years essentially fighting those people who'd been absolutely dominant between 1979 and 82, and gradually as the left retreated into the wilderness where Margaret Thatcher beat up the miners, as you'll remember, in the 84-85 miners' strike. She abolished the GLC, the great power base of Ken Livingstone and of John McDonnell, and indeed essentially abolished quite a lot of municipal power for the left in lots of local councils in that period between 84 and 86. And at the same time, you had Neil Kinnock and Roy Hattersley uniting to recreate the real battles of the 1960s and 1970s to retake control within the party. And Neil Kinnock, who I like, and who is a great interviewee in some ways once you edit him, Neil Kinnock's scars of fighting those battles, and indeed John Landsman's scars of fighting the battles, still haven't gone. A lot of the motivation of what happened under New Labour, and certainly what's happening now, of the memory in Jeremy Corbyn's mind, in John McDonnell's mind, and John Landsman's mind, of how they lost power in the 80s, is a principal motivator for a lot of the mistakes that they're currently making about Brexit and about anti-Semitism. Because their determination not to lose power again, because they remember what it was like. Old men in a hurry are very dangerous. That's exactly what's going on with a lot of the tactical thinking at the moment. Neil Kinnock and Roy Hattersley lose the 87 election, and they then lose the 92 election. Those of us old enough to remember the 92 election will remember that it looked like Labour was going to win it until both a fairly disastrous performance by Kinnock and Sheffield a week earlier, but more than that, because John Major actually was able to pick on a speech by John Smith, who was then Shadow Chancellor, which looked as though Labour was going back to tax and spend policies of the 1970s. And while Kinnock had been fighting the battle on one side within the party, on his wing rose the modernisers, as they called themselves. Blair and Brown and Mandelson, really from about 1986, 1987 onwards, thought that Kinnock was incapable of winning. And slowly you had Kinnock caught in the middle between the left, who were gradually being forced out. Militant was expelled, but Militant was never really part of the organised left within the Labour movement. It was always a cell within its own cell. But people like Landsman and McDonnell were just forced out in this direction. And on the other side, you had the modernisers, led really actually by Peter Mandelson, because he was the one who was able to corral them all into taking a position, plotting to get rid of Kinnock. And there were at least 2 plots against Kinnock that were planned in the early 1990s. And when John Smith inherited the leadership from Kinnock, there were a number of plots against John Smith, not from the left, but from what became known as New Labour. And it's only John Smith's death which has suddenly allowed the opportunity for Tony Blair to win the leadership that prevented, in my view, John Smith being deposed, not by the left, but by the right. And that would have happened in the mid-90s. Now, you all know the story of Granita and how how Tony Blair and Gordon Brown sat there and carved it up between them. It's quite interesting. When I interviewed Tony Blair, and I interviewed a lot of people around Gordon Brown. I couldn't get to Gordon Brown, but I interviewed a lot of people around Gordon Brown. And I'm not going to really talk about New Labour in too much detail. I'm very happy to. except to say a couple of things. First of all, there is no doubt in my mind, and this is where my friends on the left get very angry with me, that the Labour government, the night that Labour won in 97, if you're not a natural Labour supporter, you will not understand what I'm about to say. But one of the finest nights of my life was watching and being part of, Tony Blair's about 3 or 4 years older than me, being part of the Labour Party winning after those years of Conservative rule with a new, young, radical government that was coming in to change Britain. Unbelievably exciting night. Anyone who's a natural non-Tory was going to thinks of that night. I said to Blair, it is one of the great nights of British politics since the Second World War. And actually, my view, which is where the left disagree with me violently, and they're certainly going to disagree with me, is that first Labour government did great work. If you look at all the indices over the 10 years of Gordon Brown being Chancellor before he became Prime Minister, of child poverty, of education, of investment in the health service, of development on things like overseas development, it is a government of which any Labour supporter should be proud. And what is interesting about New Labour, when you talk to its adherents and the people who are in that government, is they kind of forget that. In the vilification that has taken place about New Labour since, its extraordinary achievements have been entirely lost. So to an extent, I've tried to do a revisionist history of that. But the other bit of it, and this is the question I asked Blair when I met him, was why it failed. Because what is really interesting about New Labour is any Conservative you meet today calls himself a Thatcherite. Margaret Thatcher's ability to enter the DNA of the Tory party has been absolute since her death. No candidate could stand for the Conservative leadership without referring to Margaret Thatcher. So I said to Blair, why do you think not a single person standing for the leadership of the Labour Party would ever now describe themselves as a Blairite? And I didn't mention Iraq. Okay, because Iraq is obvious. You know, one can write about Iraq, okay? You don't need... I said to him, you must wonder why you are now so vilified. And I asked Mandelson the same question, and I asked a number of Brownites the same question. And they looked, all of them, Blairite, Brownite, they looked at me, and the Brownites, to a man and one woman, said it was Tony Blair's fault. And when I asked Tony Blair, he said, after about an hour of going around, he said, Gordon betrayed us. And that, to me, is what's so interesting about New Labour. New Labour's failures were that the more arrogant it got in government, the more arrogant it got towards its natural supporters, the more it failed to see that within New Labour there was a split that had to be bridged, the more that split became a chasm. But actually what was really underneath it all was that dinner at Granita in 1994 when Gordon Brown believed he'd been promised the premiership after 2 terms. And the level of vitriol and unbelievable internal infighting between the Brownites and the Blairites, which crystallised around policy. Tony Blair, after 2001, became more and more obsessed by choice in public services, bringing private money into the health service, bringing private money into education, more interest in things like faith schools, which Brown really had very little interest in. But both of them were absolutely united in PFI schemes. Both of them believed the way to solve government spending was to bring in private money, and those contracts around those PFI schemes were pretty disastrous. We now owe, I think it's 200 billion in interest between now and 2040 on those PFI contracts. 200 billion is still waiting to be paid. But the real issue between Blair and Brown wasn't a real policy issue. It was entirely driven by fratricide. And as Tom Watson is now representing himself as the man who can unite the Labour Party, read the story of how he put the knife into Tony Blair in 2006 in a dramatic way. And of course there was Iraq. And Iraq broke the trust with a lot of its natural support, both middle class and working class, as well as in the trade union movement, because as Tony Blair himself admitted, and people forget he did this, in 2004, the intelligence was simply wrong, as we all remember. So you had New Labour, a 13-year aberration in the history of the Labour Party since 1979. The only time Labour has won power in 3 consecutive general elections. Tony Blair, outstandingly successful as a Labour leader, outstandingly successful as an electoral winner, and utterly repudiated, even by 2007 when Brown succeeded him. the level of vitriol towards Blair and the Blairites just entered the body politic of the Labour Party. Then Brown comes in. And Brown, it's interesting, you talk to people around Brown, and this is where he confirms Blair's story, all Brown wanted to be was not Tony Blair. In 1978, Jim Callaghan, who'd inherited the premiership from Harold Wilson, had been Chancellor of the Exchequer and Foreign Secretary and Home Secretary, had come into power, hadn't been elected, 2 years in, was going to call a general election in 1978, and he did it, and he done it, and he done it, and he did it, didn't do it. The unions had the winter of discontent in 1978 to 1979, and Labour was out for a generation. Gordon Brown, 2007, was advised by two of his closest advisors to call an immediate general election as the new Prime Minister. David Cameron was totally inexperienced as Tory leader. Labour completely had the Tories over a barrel. And Brown turned round and said, can we win 67 more seats than any other party? And why 67? Because in 2005, Tony Blair had won 66. And he didn't call a general election because he didn't have any doubts he would win it. He just might not win it as well. And then the crash took place. You're shaking your head at me. The crash took place, and the rest is history. So the issue about New Labour, as the left had been entirely eradicated by this point, the unions had been entirely blocked from influence, the Blairites, the New Labour agenda had been entirely successful in terms of policy making, yet somehow at the heart of New Labour, it never closed the deal. And the way we know that is in 2010, the leadership election between the Miliband brothers and three other candidates. Now, there's a great... I interviewed Ed Miliband for 2.5 hours, and it's a bit like Iraq with Tony Blair. As soon as you mention the D word with David, Ed's body twists into a sort of figure of 8, and he doesn't want to talk about it. What's interesting about the 2010 leadership election, Andy Burnham's got a great story. I heard somebody mention Andy Burnham. So I interviewed Andy Burnham, and Andy Burnham said, I won't try and imitate Andy's accent. Andy and I interviewed him. I said, so what happened? We talked about 2015, but actually 2010, what happened? He said, there was one cabinet meeting in 2010 after the general election that Brown held in the 5 days prior to the coalition taking office. There's one, and Andy Burnham says, I sat there, I thought this is fantastic. Ed Balls, he's the Brownite candidate. David Miliband, he's the Blairite candidate. And you know what I'm going to be? I'm going to be the Labour candidate. I can win this. And then he left Downing Street, and as he left Cabinet, and he was walking down the street, down Downing Street, he gets a phone call on his mobile from Ed Miliband, who'd been in the same Cabinet meeting, saying, oh, hi Andy, it's Ed. So I'm going to stand for the leadership. And Burnham says, I stood in Downing Street going, you're doing what? You're standing against your brother? Where I come from, you never stand against your brother. And he said, and at that point, I knew I'd lost. The two Miliband brothers were going to crush everyone between them. The question is, which one of them was going to crush the other? And the Ed Miliband campaign gave the left the first chance to come back. People like John McDonnell, who'd been unsuccessful in standing in 2007 because he couldn't get enough nominations. Diane Abbott was able to stand in 2010 with support from David Miliband and others because not having a black female candidate on the roster was regarded as being completely inappropriate. She got no support at all when she actually ran. But the campaign that the left threw behind Ed Miliband so that he would beat David was a pure tactic to ensure that the Blairites would lose control of the party. And again, just like with Tony Benn and with Dennis Healey, Ed Miliband beat his brother by just about 1% of the Electoral College. And for the next 5 years, I'm going to spool forward slightly now. Okay, we've got 10 more minutes before questions, I think. For the next 5 years, Ed Miliband, Ed Balls, and the others in that shadow cabinet sat there trying to figure out how to square the impossible circle of how to repudiate New Labour, as Ed Miliband did almost on becoming leader. So poor old Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, their closest acolytes, the heir to the throne, the prince and princesses of New Labour, just repudiated the previous 13 years under the attack from George Osborne and from David Cameron. an incredible decision just to simply say New Labour was wrong, which is the position Ed Miliband took. And they then got caught between whether you support austerity to look like a responsible proto-government, or you reject austerity and say New Labour didn't in fact screw it up. And they got caught between these two impossible propositions and carved out almost no position of economic value for themselves. That was the first issue. And the second issue was immigration, which essentially, because UKIP, by the time you get to 2014, UKIP is winning. UKIP is the first party since 1906 to win an election in this country, which wasn't Conservative, wasn't Labour, when it ran the Euro elections in 2014. And Ed Miliband, coming from a constituency that was pro-Leave, was very worried about immigration, was sitting there, despite the fact he lived in North London, very near me. So you had North London liberalism on the one hand, but then he was going to his constituency and hearing about this issue again and again and again. And as a Jew, he talks about this in the book, as a Jew and the son of Jewish immigrants into this country, being caught on the horns of the dilemma of immigration, for Ed Miliband, more than any other leader of the Labour Party, was an almost impossible thing to deal with. So you remember in the 2015 election, you had mugs saying, stop immigration, from the Labour Party. Incredible thing that Ed Miliband went through. And he still thought he'd win in 2015, and of course, the polls got it completely wrong. The one thing that Ed Miliband did do was change the way the leadership of the Labour Party would take place. So, I'm going to do a quick bit on Corbyn, and then I'll shut up. Is this okay so far, right? You're getting away? Okay, fine. In 2013, a man called Eric Joyce got, this is a technical term, I'm trying to think of the right way, got rat-faced, pissed, drunk, out of his brain in a bar in the House of Commons, in which he then assaulted, he was a Labour MP for Falkirk, and he assaulted 6 Conservatives who were in the bar standing next to him, for which he got arrested and promptly got expelled from the Labour Party, and then announced he was resigning his seat. So much for Eric Joyce. Carrie Murphy, who has gone on to be head of Corbyn's private office now, but then was working for Tom Watson, wanted the seat. She decided with her friend, I have to be very careful about the language I'm using here, but with her friend, Len McCluskey, and Unite, to flood the constituency with Unite members to get her the nomination. The Blairites in Scotland, who hated Len McCluskey, decided to oppose her. And there was a massive internal fight. It's a really great soap operatic battle about who should get the Falkirk nomination. In fact, it ended up being neither Carrie Murphy nor anybody else. And the police got called in to investigate it, and it was seen as being an absolute scandal of union management of a constituency with illicit tactics being used. And there's a debate about just how illicit they were, but I won't do that now. Miliband was advised that this was the moment where, instead of proving to vacillate over economic policy and over immigration policy, he could sort out the Labour link with the unions by introducing a new type of membership, which became known as the £3 membership. And he gave a speech in which he said, what happened at Falkirk was disgraceful. Labour cannot be tarred by this particular brush in the future. We are now going to change it so that there will be one member, one vote for the leadership as opposed to the Electoral College. And we will invite hundreds of thousands of people to join the Labour Party by only paying £3. They become registered supporters, and that, if you pay your £3, you can vote for the leadership of the Labour Party. And this got through a special conference because the unions suddenly recognised that if the PLP lost its final level of control over who could become the elected leader, then the unions, who got great control over their membership, would be far more dominant in the election of a leader going further forward. And the unions, led by a man called Paul Kenny, who's the former General Secretary of the GMB, is a brilliant negotiator, just out-negotiated Miliband's private office to create a form of electing the leader that was entirely to the benefit of union management and entirely to the lack of control of the PLP. There were 2 control mechanisms that were supposed to happen, which were critical to Corbyn's election. The original idea was that although the PLP, an individual MP, had no more power in voting than I do, The one thing the PLP would have was the ability to nominate the candidates who could stand. And there would be a 25% qualification, a bar. You had to get 25% of the Parliamentary Labour Party to nominate you, and then MEPs, just to be fair, and you could stand. And Miliband suddenly is faced with enormous pressure, not from the left, but from the Blairites, who said, you can't make it 25%, we'll never get a candidate up. And under enormous pressure, he dropped it to 20%, and he dropped it to 15%. So the one control mechanism that had been built into the process to allow the PLP to control who their candidates would be, suddenly gets 10% of the potential electorate taken away from it. That 15% bar in 2015 meant that 35 Labour MPs were needed to nominate a leader of the Labour Party. Jeremy Corbyn got 36. If it had been 20% or 25%, Jeremy Corbyn would never have been nominated. He has a lot to thank Tony Blair for, actually Peter Mandelson. It's Peter Mandelson who got that change through Ed Miliband, which is basically the reason why the left were able to run a candidate who, for the first time since 1988, stood a viable chance of winning the Labour leadership. Incredible. No one foresaw that there would be the effect of this bar being dropped, apart from about 3 backbench Labour MPs. The other change was the £3 membership, which was regarded as a total gimmick. And there's a great interview in the book with a woman called Aisha Hazikara, who is now a comedian, but was then Harriet Harman's acting chief of staff. And she describes how, after Ed Miliband had resigned and they had to run a leadership election, and they decided to have a very long leadership election because Harriet Harman hated Tom Watson. So what do? You bring in another, if you run it long, then you get another candidate to challenge Tom Watson. And of course that worked brilliantly, because by running it long, instead of having Andy Burnham and Yvette Cooper running for the leadership, which Harriet Harman didn't really care about, Yvette Cooper's a woman, she cared about that. Of course, it did allow another candidate to come through from nowhere and win. So the candidate who came through and won was Jeremy Corbyn, and no one challenged Tom Watson effectively. Completely mistaken strategy. However, the key thing was they thought the £3 membership would elicit 10, 20, 30,000 people joining up. Aisha said, this interview said, on the first day, they had thousands of people signing up, some of them as meerkats, llamas, tigers, sheep, cows. But a lot of them were returning Labour members who'd left under New Labour, or the young, motivated by social media. In 4 months, the Labour Party went from 197,000 members to 480,000 members. Think about that for a moment. Today, the figure is hovering around 500,000. Suddenly, for the first time in its history, Labour didn't need union money. It had money coming in vast quantities. But more than that, it couldn't handle the vast number of people. In that 2015 campaign, there were tens of thousands of people joining every week. And the only one of the 4 leadership campaign teams of Burnham, Liz Kendall, Yvette Cooper, and Jeremy Corbyn, the only one that had the idea of having its website, Jeremy for Leader, with a button that said, if you want Jeremy Corbyn to be leader of the Labour Party, you can push on this button and you can join the Labour Party now. Then you can come back and vote for us. None of the other campaigns bothered to have a website that did a link with the Labour Party membership. They were entirely at my friend John Lansman, who ran that campaign. The level of manoeuvring that the left did was an act of political genius. Jeremy Corbyn's campaign in 2015 was the most astonishing political campaign out of nowhere, born from the engine of social media and a bunch of veterans who were determined not to lose. Andy Burnham, Yvette Cooper couldn't even agree whether one of them would drop out to be the sole challenger. It was just like the SDP in 1981 and 1980, not knowing how to take the left on in a battle where tactics meant everything. Last bit I'm going to talk about before I shut up is what happened in 2016 as the final bit. It's not the final bit of the story continuing as we speak. So then, after the referendum campaign, you'll remember the referendum campaign, Jeremy Corbyn went on holiday through it. Labour was barely there. It was run by a bunch of big tent New Labourites. Did a pretty lousy job. David Cameron did an even worse job. The left really weren't involved. And then the following day, Margaret Hodge and Anne Coffey now left-leaning party, decided to put a motion no confidence against Jeremy Corbyn to the PLP when 90% of the shadow cabinet were at Glastonbury. And there is a fantastic series of stories of how these shadow cabinet members were all at Glastonbury drinking cocktails or doing whatever the hell else they were doing, waiting for Adele, who was the headliner on the Sunday, and suddenly being summoned back to London as they read in the Observer that Hilary Benn is about to resign, and they'll think, we should all resign. So, I mean, I have to say I'm very proud of the chapters on this, because I got a lot of really... I said to Margaret Hodge, why did you do it? And she said, well, we thought it was a kind of good idea, and we thought, lots of us would vote to get him out, they'd all resign, and we'd all vote against him, and then he'd just go. And I said, well, why would Jeremy Corbyn, who's never given the monkeys about the PLP, who's never cared, he was elected in one member, one vote, why would he care? She said, well, I don't know, we didn't really think about it. And he didn't care, and he didn't go. And then we were screwed. And I won't use the language and assure that Margaret used to me, but it's in the book. I said to, there are a vast number of extraordinarily talented Labour frontbench spokespeople from that era who just resigned with absolutely no idea how they were going to win. No idea. It was clueless. And again, unfortunately, I can't use the great quote from John MacDonald, but as plotters, they were useless, is the great quote from John MacDonald. They were useless. So yet again, at the moment when, if you're an anti-Corbynista, you could possibly have won, they completely balls it up. They had no structure, no organisation, no idea what they were going to do. And the left won again in 2016. Momentum owes its great success to Margaret Hodge. Momentum was losing members. It was down to 3,100 members just after the referendum in 2016. By September, it was up to 28,000. It's now at 42,000. Every time there's a crisis where the left have to coalesce around Corbyn, this is directly relevant to what's going on now. And they're faced with the choice of supporting Corbyn, and a lot of them do not support Corbyn personally. Okay? Corbyn was the best of the... Corbyn didn't want to stand, they didn't want him to stand, he was the only one they were standing, and they won. Then he became a cult, and now they have to root to him. But every time there's a crisis, they get stronger because their opponents get weaker. This is the story of 2015, 2016, and 2017 with the general election. And then we hit 2018. And as I describe it in the book of the 4 summers of Jeremy Corbyn, this is the 4th summer. And in 2018, we suddenly have the 2 riders of the apocalypse within the Labour movement. Anti-Semitism and Brexit. And now I'm going to shut up.
I'm Arlene Lester. Hello there. You said fairly early on in your talk that... sorry, I'll turn sideways. I was saying that you said fairly early on in your talk, I think you said, where's the nail clinic? And do I take it from that you think there isn't one now? And can I just add a little, Ryder? Are you ignoring the women?
Okay, I'll tell you what we're going to do. Why don't I take 2 or 3 questions at a time, and then I'll write them down, repeat them, and then answer them.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Oh, that's it. I'm in a dilemma. I joined the Labour Party 61 years ago, when I was 16 and still at school, the last year at school. And I am now an honorary life member. It means I don't have to pay any subs. So I just let it flow. The dilemma is, if there is an election soon, I'm having difficulty knowing who to vote for, even though I'm still technically a member of the party. I think it was 90, I'm trying to think now, I think it was in 96 or 97, when I had a lot of, I forgot what they call them, the people like in Liverpool, the militants, and in North East Leeds, which is this constituency, it got to such a state, I wrote a letter to the National Executive with some other people, and it finished up with this particular constituency being destroyed. Well, it was closed down, and we had to run an election, and President MP got elected at that time. What it is, my problem is, I could not vote for a chaotic Tory party, as it is, as Brexit has shown. I can't vote for an incompetent opposition led by Jeremy Corbyn. He has become a cult figure. Been two cult figures with initials JC, and you know what the other JC is, and it's not the Jewish Chronicle. Can you give us any advice? Because it's going to be very, very difficult. because I think a lot of people just won't vote.
First of all, can I say how eloquent you were in your speech, and it was very clear, and it was. I think everybody enjoyed and got a lot out of it. But my question is, where do you see the Labour Party going in the future from now?
If I take these three, so let me just repeat it, because I actually think there's some connections between these questions which I've tried. So Ollie asked, who's the new Neil Kinnock and what about the women? Leonard asked about the dilemma who to vote for. One thing I should have said was, it is my personal opinion, this is the worst government, if not of my lifetime, then pretty close to the worst government of my lifetime. And the idea that Labour is not capable of taking leadership in this country with this government is extraordinary. So just to make it, so what advice about who to vote for, and then what's the future of the Labour Party? Where's it going to go? Is that right, Terry? Right? Okay. So, this is where having written a 430-page book about the past, you don't want me to talk about the future. So thank you very much for that. That's helpful. My own crystal ball, which is hopeless. So let's talk about women first of all. So there is currently the mood within the Labour Party is the next leader has to be a woman. If the next leader has to be a woman, there are 4 potential female candidates, and this is partially answering the question about the future of the party. Emily Thornberry, or as she's otherwise known, Ursula the Sea Witch. For those of you who've seen Little Mermaid, you'll know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, it doesn't matter. Rebecca Long-Bailey, who will be the candidate, probably of Momentum on the left if she stands, but is highly untested and untried. Angela Rayner, who's got substantial union support. Is Angela Rayner a putative leader of the opposition or Prime Minister? And there are talks of, from the other wings of the party, people like Yvette Cooper. So the question is, if you don't believe that the leader has to be a woman, are there other better candidates out there? And Keir Starmer is clearly a candidate to answer the question about Neil Kinnock. If I had to look at the current front bench as to who is capable of being a Prime Minister and capable of uniting the party in terms of the performance, I'd say Keir Starmer is probably as close to it as anybody who's there. But part of the problem with the current Shadow Cabinet, and a couple of members of the Shadow Cabinet I'm very good friends with, is they have been so supine in the face of what's been going on, both about Brexit and about anti-Semitism. And I think now one of the questions, it's not a gender issue, it's a political issue, is who's going to grasp the nettle of leadership if the leadership doesn't. Clearly, John McDonnell has been trying to grasp it, but he will not be standing for the leadership because his wife won't let him after his triple bypass. And Tom Watson always thinks he's a candidate, but personally I don't see that. If I had to put money on forecasting what will happen next, and I am coming round to your question about who to vote for, my crystal ball tells me that there will be a resolution of Brexit. My own view, shout me down, is I think Theresa May, who I personally cannot stand and who I think has done a terrible... I've actually read the 589 pages of the withdrawal agreement, and I've read the political agreement. And as somebody who was a commercial negotiator for 20 years, I've read many legal documents. The withdrawal agreement is a very badly crafted document that just gets you to the point of departure. There is no sense of what happens in terms of the real negotiation. So Theresa May will go. I think she'll get her deal through because in lieu of that or a no deal, I can't see a second referendum getting through at the moment. So, if she gets a deal through, she'll be deposed within 6 to 9 months, if not at the 11-month mark in December. a new Conservative Prime Minister, a new Conservative leader taking on Jeremy Corbyn in a general election in 2020, I think is a real probability. And who would win that? Well, my view is it depends who the Tory leader is, but you have to believe that Jeremy Corbyn will have an enormous problem pulling off the same trick he did in 2017. He's no longer new and fresh, despite the fact he was 67. I think he is looking aged. I think the Labour Party is badly tarnished. I think within the Labour Party, the battle over the second referendum, which I didn't really talk about, has been a hugely damaging fight within the left. And I think anti-Semitism, not before time, is growing as a massive battle within the left. Those of you who haven't seen it should look at Momentum's video on anti-Semitism 3 days ago, which is an extraordinarily effective attack on anti-Semitic left-wing tropes. Momentum, led by John Lansman, a Jew, led by Laura Parker, led by others, are determined now to fight their own backyard. They want Williamson out. So actually the battle within the left is becoming very intense, and that battle is focused on the leader and the leader's office, and particularly Seamus Milne and Carrie Murphy. So who do you vote for? I live in Jeremy Corbyn's constituency. My parents live in Keir Starmer's constituency. I should have moved 300 yards up the road. I'd have a much easier decision. So I think it is an unbelievably difficult decision. And I speak as a Labour Party member. I think getting out this government, and I forget Brexit, look at indices on poverty, look at the things that we actually care about, okay? Look at the hapless nature of this government with Chris Grayling. I mean, it's laughable, right? And then I look at Jeremy Corbyn and Seamus Milne and others in 10 Downing Street, and I quail like you do. So I guess you end up voting for nobody or voting for something else. I didn't mention those who have left. I interviewed Luciana Berger 3 times, so nobody asked me about anti-Semitism. Do you want me to talk about anti-Semitism? It's kind of interesting that none of you raised it. Okay. So I interviewed Louise Ellman, Margaret Hodge, Luciana Berger, and saw the stuff they were being sent 4 months ago. And, I mean, you know, I come out of a rough old school. I was a foreign news journalist with 15 years of my career in war zones. I have not read stuff like the stuff that Luciana Berger was getting. It hasn't been made public. And it was, you know, threats of throwing acid in the face of a then 6-month-old baby. I mean, it was really serious stuff. Louise Ellman was under huge personal attack. And Louise Ellman is the most unassuming effective human being. When Ruth Smeeth, at the Chakrabarti anti-Semitism report launched in 2016, some of you will remember, a report that came and went without trace, apart from making her a member of the Shadow Cabinet, Ruth Smeeth got into a row with a black activist called Mark Mark Wordsworth. She received in the following week 25,000 tweets and Facebook messages, none of which are repeatable in front of you. Even in a pub, they're not repeatable. Mossad agent, CIA agent. The Rothschild trope is the one that Momentum focus on this week. You know, it is really dirty and unpleasant out there. And having written the narrative of what happened, because I thought the narrative had to be written, it was very interesting. People who read the book, my non-Jewish friends who read it said, haven't you banged on a bit about anti-Semitism? Because it's gone to 2 chapters now. And my Jewish friends who read it said, you haven't done enough. And the truth is, actually telling a narrative of what happened bit by bit by bit. The IHRA debate within the NEC is actually incredibly complex, yet incredibly important. Corbyn's response to that in September when he tried to rewrite it at the last minute. The stuff that has been going on in constituency parties, this is now going to boil over in a very, very serious way. And the question you have to ask yourself, and this is why I do come back to 1982 and the kind of Neil Kinnock argument, is do you stay or do you go? And to give you just one small example of what I'm talking about, last week, some of you will know that in Hackney North CLP, which is Diane Abbott's constituency, there was a motion passed effectively supporting Chris Williamson. I mean, it wasn't worded like that, but that's essentially the vote was, I think, 35-25 in favour of that motion, as Diane Abbott sat idly by. 6 votes going the opposite direction, that motion would have been defeated. So my own view is the next leader of the Labour Party will not be a Corbynista. There's a very interesting generational problem that they have people of my age and older. They don't have anybody in their 50s who's a straight Corbynista. And so actually, John Lansman's problem now is how do you keep the project going while you are currently taking a stronger and stronger argument with Lotto, leader's office, against anti-Semitism. And there is a fissure on the left, which means the next leader of the Labour Party will almost certainly not be a Corbynista. The question is it a Kinnock figure who can reunite the party? And I think that is a very big open question, given the lack of talent that's around at the moment. Well, I'm not a fan of David Miliband's, having studied how he failed miserably to take on Brown and then take on his brother, but I don't think he'll be coming back. I don't think he thinks he can win. In a current Labour Party of 500,000 members, David Miliband is not going to win it. A Blairite with his record isn't going to win it. Chucker's not going to be allowed back anytime soon. I don't think he wants to be allowed back anyway. I think that generation of politicians, Hilary Benn, admirable, David Miliband, in my view, slightly less admirable, but still, tenable. I don't think that generation of politicians can win in a Labour Party that's got 400 or 500,000 members, almost half of whom have only been in the Labour Party for the last 2.5 years. Would that we had more members of 60 years standing. But I mean, the point is, you are talking here about a political party that has gone through a massive transformation that it never for one moment expected to go through. And the consequences of this are entirely unexpected. What is happening now is that Corbyn himself did not expect what has happened to him about both Brexit and anti-Semitism in terms of the party reacting against him. There is and I write a lot about this in the Brexit charges, the campaign on the left against Jeremy Corbyn is becoming much stronger. But in the constituencies, you've still got all these kids who join through social media. I'm happy to take 3 more. I'll take some more questions.
So my name's Geoff Hobson. I was a friend of Walter Harrison, who was the Deputy Chief Whip of the Labour Party, who your friend over there may know. Is there anything in your book about the secret negotiations in Dublin that Walter Harrison did on behalf of the Labour Party?
Short question. Congratulations on the presentation. Fantastic. I don't usually ask questions, but I'm stimulated to do so. A short question. One of the big changes we've seen in elections, both here and in the States, is the effect of social media and the internet. And I don't think you mentioned it. I might have been asleep at the time, but I don't think you did. Could you comment on how you see that evolving in politics in this country?
Hi. Do you think more Labour MPs will leave to join the independent group?
Walter Harrison, legendary Deputy Chief Whip, bruiser, man who got the votes through for Callaghan. But no, I didn't. In terms of social media, I mean, I did mention it, but let me just say, so I have 2 sisters who are absolutely paranoid about the way this book's going to be trolled when it comes out. And to which my simple answer is, no problem. I'm not on Facebook or Twitter. They can troll away as much as they like, because I don't care, because I won't be reading it. There is no question at all that social media is an engine now of change, good or bad, that will not be going away. And it is incredible how has a wildfire effect. Its impact and its potency is huge. The question is how it's utilised. And unfortunately, the fact that it's not regulated, the fact that anybody can write anything, and the fact that they do, and the fact that it then spreads like wildfire is something that, to be honest with you, with the possible exception of Tally, looking around this room, nobody in this room is probably capable of knowing how to manage it, because we're the wrong generation. I'm certainly the wrong generation. And I think that although the left used it to drive enormous support for Corbyn in 2015, certainly now they feel they're losing control of it, because what you've got are elements of extremism on both left and right that are out of control. And that isn't going to be managed through a political process. It's going to be managed by legislation or not at all. In terms of more people joining the Tiggers, people here may have a differing view on this. I find the Tiggers I thought their timing was appalling. What I do not understand I'm talking about the Labour Party members of it, is if you were going to leave, and who can blame you, Wait till the Brexit votes, the most critical votes of the next 2 or 3 weeks, when you can put pressure on Corbyn within the party to actually do what you want to do. I mean, walking out now, it seems to me, has achieved absolutely nothing apart from some press. I don't think a single one of those MPs will be a member of Parliament when the next election takes place, given the size of the majorities in those seats. So will others join them? Fear. You've got fear on the one hand of joining them and your career being over. And on the other hand, you've got hatred and fear about what's happening within the Labour Party. I'm not capable of talking about the Conservative Party. And there is no doubt there probably are 20 or 30 more Labour MPs who would consider leaving if there's if there any deselections take place. Let's just remember, there have been no deselections. There have been motions of no confidence. Nobody has been deselected. I don't think you'll see many deselections. I don't think the left will do that. They're not that stupid. So my guess is you'll get a few people leaving because they're putting themselves in a position to do it. I also think, however, it is not going to be anything like the impact of the SDP. The opinion polls change week by week. The real question is whether you can regain control within the Labour Party. And that's what a lot of those... Yvette Cooper isn't going to join the Kippers. She's going to stay in the Labour Party. Keir Starmer's not going to go. Jonathan Ashworth isn't going to go. These people are not going to leave. And they are the equivalent, effectively, of Shirley Williams and David Owen in 81. So I don't see it. But I have to say, I'll come back in a year's time and you can tell me I was entirely wrong, because it's easy to be wrong about this.
So, David, I want to thank you very, very much indeed for coming, for giving us the benefit of your wealth of experience and your ability to put it across to a provincial show crowd. I mean, what do you expect? But just so that you know a bit about the community, I would like to present you with this book, which is sort of Dan Saunders and Philippa Lester, and they're here. And if you want to speak to them, it'll just give you a little bit of idea. It's not a start to finish; it will just tell you. But it's a token of our esteem anyway. And thank you very, very much for coming.
My pleasure.
For sharing the meeting. We've created our own minhag. I hope it continues. And nobody's remarked about my Labour Party tie. I don't think I'll need it much longer. Yes. Thank you. The next meeting, which is with Millen, and Dan will talk about it later, is at BHH. It is Professor Sue Weiss who will talk about British Jewish dramatists, in particular Jack Rosenthal, who was the husband of Maureen Lipman. That's at BHH on the 28th of March, the Thursday. It's all in the History Month, thank you, yes. And 4 days later, on April the 1st, here we have Dr. Elaine Harwood, who will talk about German Jewish architects who came to England, and in particular the advocates of the Bauhaus movement. That's two meetings. The 27th, the 28th, so that's Brexit Day. -1, yes. 28th of March and the 1st of April. Thank you. And
Radio Jacob.